Welcome back to Educational Relevance, a platform for experienced educators to share proven successful strategies to educate today's students. I'm Brian Wright. I'm currently a consultant in the Racine Unified School District. I'm also an adjunct professor at Concordia University in leadership classes. Along with me today, Mark Macbeth, my partner in crime. Mark is an accomplished author in education. He is a tremendous administrator in both central office and school buildings. He's also a guy who will speak about his beliefs in code and his belief in education and restorative practice. Today we have Diana Beitz.
Bites.
Along with us today, we have Diana Beitz. Diana has spent 31 years in public education, mainly working with at-risk populations in grades K to 12. Her experience ranges, including a classroom teacher, a learning coach, achievement coordinator, and principal. She holds a master's in educational technology from Washburn University. Diana, welcome. So good to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
Diana, I say this to you. We are so honored to have you because you're going to talk about restorative practices. Mark, I'm going to turn this over to you. So, Mark, why don't you get started?
Thanks. So we've been talking about discipline. Is this restorative practice really about discipline? What is it about?
It's about building a culture within a school, within a classroom, if it's not school-wide, where everybody holds respect for each other as well as respect for themselves. And once you have that really intense level of respect, then what you find is that those discipline issues really aren't issues anymore.
So you and I have talked about this briefly before, but is restorative practices something that's like an elementary program or middle school program, high school? Where does it fit into the school system?
I personally have used it at the middle and high school levels. It can be used in the elementary as well. You would just alter maybe your questioning and things a little bit, but it is definitely very powerful at the secondary level. It's kind of an offshoot of the restorative justice programs that came about in the legal system.
If I could ask a question right now, Danny, you're talking about the restorative justice system. I'm also a secondary school administrator as well. Our program's about code. Why don't you tell us your personal code and how does restorative practices embed into your code of what you have?
My personal code always do what's best for kids. And that was always something that at the end of the day, if I went home and felt like I had advocated for my students and advocated for what they needed and done everything I could to get them that, I felt like I had done a good job. And so when it came down to what was my last couple of years when I went back to the classroom, I actually had on my wall, it was something along the lines of, if what you're doing interferes with somebody's learning, hurts someone's heart, or prevents you from being yourself, you shouldn't be doing it. And I think that kind of tied into what's best for the kids. And it made them think about what is best for themselves as well.
Well, what about the kid in the classroom who just is being really disruptive and hurting other kids in the classroom because of that behavior? I know there's this thing called zero tolerance. Let's just get rid of them. What's the difference between this restorative practices and letting the kid go home and suspend them?
Well, in my experience, most of the kids that were doing the things that were really hurting other people, sending them home to sit and play on their video games or go roam the streets or do whatever it was they did outside of the school building was really not a punishment. And in some cases, they were doing those things because that's exactly what they wanted. And the two can very much still coexist. Just because a school is a restorative practices school doesn't mean that you aren't still going to suspend a kid. But it adds a piece onto that where when they come back from that suspension, when they return to the classroom, whatever that is, they have to fix what they wronged. They have to make that wrong better. And that goes back to that respect that you've spent the time building prior to whatever misdeed it was that they got in trouble for.
You got a question, Brian?
I'm hearing you speak about the changes in culture. As an administrator, how do you relate this to your teachers, basically those teachers who are always saying these kids can't do or these kids don't want to?
The teachers who want blood every time that they say this kid's messing up. The first place that I've personally encountered restorative practices, I was a behavior interventionist in a middle school. It was a challenging middle school. I was a full-time behavior interventionist. So we did a school-wide training for all of the teachers. We had somebody who was a restorative practices facilitator, and we did a training for all of our teachers. And a huge part of my job, once we got kind of everybody trained and on board, was if the student was creating a problem for a teacher, they would call. I would go to their classroom, and it wasn't to take that student out. My job was to go in and take that teacher's classroom so that that teacher and the student could go out in the privacy of the hall and have a conversation and hopefully be able to figure that out and work it out, because we had given the teachers those tools to be able to have those conversations.
What kind of conversations are those? Are they yes, no, behave? What are they?
So when you are a restorative practices school, when you're talking to somebody who has done something, somebody who has caused harm, you're always bringing them back to basically 5 questions. What was it that happened? So I want to know what that kid saw that had them do that. But then you dive into, what were you thinking about at that time? So if, let's say, a kid throws a notebook across the room and knocks somebody's water bottle over, what were you thinking about at the time? Well, I was just thinking I was trying to get the kid next to him's attention and I miscalculated my throw. Or maybe I was mad at this kid because I thought that was my water bottle. And then talking to him about, since this happened 10 minutes ago, 5 minutes ago, what have you been thinking? What do you think of that now? So you're kind of getting them to think about it from the perspective of what was the headspace they were in at the moment. And now that they've had a few minutes to kind of settle a little bit, what were they thinking about that in retrospect? Then you ask them about, okay, who was impacted? Who was harmed? Who was affected by this? And sometimes you have to kind of lead them down that road a little bit. Well, okay, so the kid who you hit with the notebook. Well, what about the kid who got water spilled on their book bag? What about all the kids in the room that had to stop what they were doing because the teacher had to stop? And then the final question is, what can you do to help make things right at this point?
So you mentioned at the beginning, tools that you gave to teachers before that conversation took place so they knew how to guide that conversation in a positive direction.
So we did a lot of things in our building. We used win-win discipline from Kagan. We trained all of our teachers in that. So they had those kind of in the moment types of things. All of our classes, all of our students did restorative circles, had circles in their classes, in their advisories on a weekly basis. So they had gotten to know each other and start to really build those communities. And that was probably the most powerful thing that was the teachers who really leaned into that and really kind of took that and ran with it. They were the ones that, quite frankly, very seldom had issues because they were very much had created a community where all of the kids could be learners. And the kids who maybe weren't in other classes would be kind of pressured into it almost by other kids because they would just be like, I've got something to do. I'm not going to mess with you right now.
You know, one of the things that Brian and I have talked about in the whole discipline thing is a lot of schools, administrators, teachers are reactive to situations. This circle that you were talking about seems like it's more proactive.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So a circle, we had them scheduled regularly. In my comprehensive schools, it might be something where it was done once a week. That on Tuesdays during your advisory time, you did a circle. And when you had a circle, you would literally move your furniture so that there was nothing in between you. It was you and me sitting there equal. Nobody's behind a desk or leaning on, or sleeping on a desk or something. There's no corners, so everybody can see everybody else. And we would use a talking piece. Where restorative practices comes from some of the Indigenous cultures. And they would literally have a talking stick. And anything could be a talking piece. It could be, I had a coat hanger hook that was kind of funny. That was what we used because the kids thought it was funny. I knew people that used a stuffed animal. And that would just get passed around. And if you weren't holding it, that was the only person that could talk, was the person holding that. So we would do that. And sometimes it would be kind of, you could go around the circle and do kind of just a fun question. What's your favorite pizza topping? Because you may figure out that this kid that you thought was really annoying over there also likes Hawaiian pizza. Then you might also add questions in that would be, a little meatier. What is something that you really appreciate about this class? Or what is something that you would like to see changed? Those types of things. So it gave everybody the chance to be heard and everybody a chance to talk, which is really important as well.
In these circles, did the teacher establish a discussion between what are rules and what are norms? It's in these discussions where there's such a conversation takes place, and how far will the teacher allow the students to go in that regard if they're coming to agreement in those circles?
Because we did it in pretty much all of our classes, it was really important that everybody have those same kinds of norms, so that if you were in math class and there was a circle, you knew what to expect. And so we just kind of put it out there as, this is how this works. This is what we're going to do. And so it was just an expectation that we put out there.
So I'm wondering, Diana, when is a school ready for this? Brian and I turn around underperforming schools. When does this come into a school?
It comes into a school when you have enough people that genuinely care about kids and have the heart to try something completely different. And when you have some leaders that are willing to actually change behaviors of kids. And we all know that suspending kids, doing detentions, those things, if they worked, we wouldn't still need to do them. You wouldn't see the same kids being suspended over and over. You wouldn't see the same kids in detention or on the detention list, whether they show up or not, over and over. You wouldn't see that. So this was something where especially having a leader in the school who says, we're going to do something different. That was, I think, always the really key element, was having that leader who came in and said, we're going to do this. And finding those key people within the school that are going to be a part of that change.
So how did you handle, Diana, and that you personally, how did you handle those students that were incorrigible? We all have that 10% in the school that those kids don't listen too much to anyone. How did it play with those students, and how did you make the adjustments accordingly?
I had one kid, this was when I was principal at an alternative high school, and we did away with in-school suspension. We had an RJ room, is what we called it. And if what we would do, and we were an alternative school, so we get a little leeway on doing things a little more our way. But we had, in order for a kid, once they had gotten to the point where they had been removed from a class, they had to go through the RJ process to get back into their classes. And well, honestly, this particular girl, we just waited her out. She thought, well, I'm going to sit here and do my day or two or whatever it is, and then I'll go back to class and I can just keep acting the fool again. And they were like, no, until you're ready to have these conversations and take them seriously. And she was still doing her educational pieces. She was still making progress towards graduation, but she wasn't where she wanted to be. So we kind of played that a little bit with her. And she finally decided that she wasn't going to outweigh us. And this was a young lady who at the beginning of our relationship, we butted heads hard. I mean, like, really hard. And before it was all said and done, she's now in her mid-20s, and she actually called me to tell me she was headed to the hospital to have her baby not very long ago. So she knew that once she realized we weren't going to give up on her, it wasn't that we weren't going to give up on keeping her in there, it was we weren't giving up on her. And that was a real change for her.
Okay.
So it sounds like you still can hold a kid accountable.
Absolutely.
But you're really trying to meet the kids' needs and make them feel valued.
Absolutely.
But also value other people, kind of, right?
Yeah, because let's face it, a lot of the kids that are that are acting up, those incorrigible ones, they're doing that because their needs aren't being met. And they figured out, usually at a pretty early age, that one way they can have their needs met is to act out. And having people around them that are just going to be calm and, you know what, I don't like what you did, but I still care about you and I want the best for you. So we're going to just keep this path until we figure out how to make that work. And, were there times when, I had kids who brought drugs to school? I don't have a choice. I'm going to suspend you. That's what the district says I have to do. There's certain things. But when they came back, they then had to go through the process of making it right. Who did they harm? Well, maybe it wasn't necessarily somebody at school or one of the other students. Maybe it was our resource officer, because he then had to do all of the work that it took, because he had to do all the paperwork for that kid having drugs at school. Maybe it was the school secretary who was the one who found them, whatever it was. So they still very much had consequences. That was never taken out of the equation. And I think that's something that people think with restorative practices, that, oh, well, we're just going to hold hands and sing Kumbaya and call it good. And that's not it. There's still consequences. If you broke something, you still get to replace it. That's part of making it right.
Yeah. So you mentioned, so I got final questions if you have anything else, Brian.
I want to say, you mentioned Kagan's win-win rod that you used before. Is there any other educators that you use, maybe a Ruby Payne or Shiraki Holly, or that some other skills that you...
Jim Fay, and all of those are such wonderful, any of those types of things, they all have they give you great tools for your toolbox. And having a really deep toolbox is great because you can pull out the tool that you need at that particular moment.
Mm-hmm.
And when our teachers don't necessarily have a really deep toolbox, especially your younger teachers, if they don't have, or the old ones that have just lost some of those tools over the years, maybe they loaned them to somebody and they never got them back. But, when you give them tools in their toolbox so that they can pull out that correct tool at the correct time, it makes a huge difference. Because what works with one kid in a very similar situation may not work at all with the next. We all know this.
Well, one more question, Mark, if I may. And this applies to Mark. Mark is the inventor of a thing called the discipline matrix. And we have used that. And as a matter of fact, he gave it to me back in 4 schools before I retired. And I used it in 4 different schools since then. 4 or 5 schools, Mark. I forgot which ones they were, but definitely
And
4.
you shared it with a ton of other administrators in between too.
And I
So
teach that in class. How would a discipline matrix be utilized and incorporated into the restorative practice that you share with teachers?
So it could just be something where you're going to have to be able to sit down and have a full-on restorative conference with certain people to come back. If you had a physical altercation with another student, maybe it's you and that other student have to sit down, and when you both come back off of suspension, work it out. You guys have PE together.
Mm-hmm.
Let's figure out how that's going to work from here. If it was a student and a teacher, and I did have a student who felt like a teacher was picking on them. And so how did that work? So it can just be written into that, just like the kid's going to get 1 to 3 days of in-school suspension and a restorative conference or repair their harm.
yeah, and I can really see it holding teachers accountable to the classroom piece of the matrix. Here's what you do in the classroom before you ever send a kid to the office. I know that this is a carpenter pencil that I'm showing here, but Diana hates pencils when kids are sent to the office for
pencils. Send the kid to the office because they didn't have a pencil with them, or they were wearing a hat. I had that one too.
And so this really allows the teacher, gives them skills inside that classroom before they ever send them. And then it gives the kid dignity, it sounds like, when they are sent to the office with the matrix and you're going, oh, dang it. This is step 3. It's a 3-day suspension, but man, we're going to build a plan so you're successful so you never repeat it again. Right? And I think that's what I'm hearing from you.
Yeah, very much, because we want them to learn from their mistakes. That's the whole point. We all make mistakes, but being able to learn from them and not repeat them is what it is when you start to mature and grow up.
Student learning first. Yeah.
So I'm a big avid person, Diana. It sounds a lot like your circles, a lot like Socratic seminars that we were
Very much.
classroom. So it sounds similar to that.
Amazing how all those powerful things are a lot alike.
Indeed, they are. And I think Harvard is looking forward to getting students who are going to be successful. Dan, I want to make sure I give you the last word today and what you think and what you want our viewers to take away from the discussion we had today.
Just that it's always important to be able to think about what is best for your kids and be able to look outside the box, because our kids don't live in boxes, especially anymore. We have to find the solutions that work for the kids that we have in front of us today.
For Dan, the first one, I heard you use the word powerful a couple of times, and that's one of my partner's favorite words about powerful. But I will say to you, that is a tremendous statement to have. And thinking of my partner, Mark, is there anything else you want to finish us off with today?
It's hard to top that one. I really appreciate it, Diana. I just thank you very much. I thought it was an excellent session. Appreciate it.
And thanks for having me.
Diana Beitz, it has been an honor having you on this program today. We look forward to you coming back sometime again, if you don't mind.
Anytime.
Joining us. And to all our viewers out there, we want to say thank you for being a part of us. And we hope that you have a great time to our next session.